With this video and the subsequent videos, we'll look at specific question types within the reading comprehension passages, the long and short passages, the non-argument based passages, beginning with this one dealing with specific detail questions. So, detail questions ask you to find the answer to a question about some specific detail that is explicitly stated in the passage, more or less explicitly stated. In other words, it's not something that requires you to do a whole lot of reading between the lines or inferring. It should be something a little more explicit. The words that tell you that you are dealing with a detail question, according to the passage indicates, the passage states, those are the most common phrases that indicate that you're dealing with one of these questions. And so on these questions, the correct answer should be a close paraphrase of something that you can directly point to in the passage. So in other words, you don't want to find yourself saying something like, I guess this is right, or I think I saw that in the passage. You want to be able to point to some specific line or set of lines and say, here's the evidence that supports this answer choice. And so again, find the evidence. Think of it like an open book test where the evidence should be on the screen in front of you. It's a matter of finding it. So the strategy that we want to use here, use the question stem as a prompt to scan through the passage. So in other words, what the question is asking you, you take that and you say, okay, I'm going to go find that information. Then locate the evidence that answers the question, and it could be multiple pieces of evidence if it's a check all that apply question, and we'll see one of those here in just a minute. And then write down your approximate answer. And by approximate answer, what we mean here is just a brief 1 or 2 or 3 or maybe 4 or 5 word answer that approximates the kind of thing that you expect to be looking for, because we don't expect to be able to get it exactly right. They're going to use different words, synonyms of what's in the passage, again, paraphrasing what's in the passage, so we only need to approximate, but then we have that approximate answer, and then we use that to find the answer choice. So we want to look for the answer choice that best matches your approximate answer. If you don't find anything that matches your approximate answer, well, we'll talk about some plan B options as we go forward, but that's the basic recipe that we want to use whenever possible. Okay, so let's look at an example, and since we haven't read any of this passage, we'll go ahead and read the paragraph first. In the 1980s, neuroscientists studying the brain processes underlying our sense of conscious will compared subjects' judgments regarding their subjective will to move, W, and actual movement, M, with objective electroencephalographic activity called readiness potential, or RP. As expected, W preceded M. Subjects consciously perceive the intention to move as preceding a conscious experience of actually moving. This might seem to suggest an appropriate correspondence between the sequence of subjective experiences and the sequence of the underlying events in the brain. But researchers found a surprising temporal relation between subjective experience and objectively measured neural events. In direct contradiction of the classical conception of free will, neural preparation to move, RP, preceded conscious awareness of the intention to move by hundreds of milliseconds. So RP precedes W, and if W precedes M, that suggests the full sequence would be RP, readiness potential, followed by W, will to move, and M, actual movement. Okay, so, and this is the new finding described in the passage here. Okay, so based on the information contained in the passage, which of the following chains of events would most closely conform to the classical conception of free will? Okay, so here, the classical conception is alluded to in this last sentence, and what it says here again is that this idea that RP actually precedes W is in contradiction to the classical understanding. So what that means is that the classical understanding would suggest that W precedes RP. And while they don't mention M, we'd have to conclude that M is last because that's the actual movement. So we wouldn't expect the readiness potential in the brain to come after the movement. Okay, so that's going to be our approximate answer here, this sequence. And then what we see here in option A maps onto that perfectly. W followed by RP followed by M. So we've done the thinking first, and then that saves us time as we sift through the answer choices. And here the first choice turns out to be correct, but let's just look at the others. RP followed by W. Nope, that's the new idea. M followed by W. Actual movement followed by the will to move. Doesn't really make sense. RP followed by M followed by W. The actual movement followed by the will to move. Nope. RP followed by W and M simultaneously. Nope. So let's look at a second example. And again, we'll start by reading the paragraph and then turn our attention to the question. So the nearly circular orbits of planets in our solar system led scientists to expect that planets around other stars would also reside in circular orbits. However, most known extrasolar planets reside in heavily elongated and not circular orbits. Why? The best clue comes from comets in our solar system. Comets formed in circular orbits but were gravitationally flung into their present-day elliptical orbits when they ventured too close to planets. Astronomers suspect that pairs of planets also engage in this slingshot activity, leaving them in disturbed elliptical orbits. If two planets form in close orbits, one will be scattered inward toward its star and the other outward. They will likely then travel close enough to neighboring planets to disturb their orbits also. It's a check all that apply question. It asks us which of the following factors help account for the elliptical shape of the orbits of extrasolar planets. So we've got planets and we've got comets. But now our evidence here, we're really going to find two main pieces of evidence. The first piece or group of pieces is here in yellow. So we'll note that the first part is talking about comets, but then it extends that to a discussion of pairs of planets. And it says that pairs of planets engage in this slingshot activity. So what is this slingshot activity? It's this idea that comets were flung into elliptical orbits when they'd ventured too close to planets. So if you have pairs of planets that engage in this slingshot activity, that means that the planets are close together. A pair of planets close together. And then the second piece of evidence is here at the end. And it says that if two planets form in close orbits, one will be scattered inward, the other outward. They will then travel close enough to neighboring planets to disturb their orbits also. So, two pieces of evidence. One, they form close together. Two, if one travels close to a neighboring planet, regardless of where they were in relation to one another when they formed. So we have those two pieces of information. We turn our attention to the answer choices. The planet's formation in close proximity to other planets, that is a really good match for the bit in yellow. The gravitational influence of planets whose original orbits have been disturbed. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but we turn back here and it says the ones that have been disturbed will likely then travel close enough to neighboring planets. They will exert a gravitational influence on other planets if their original orbits have been disturbed. So that's a match there. The gravitational influence of comets, no. They talk about comets, but they don't describe them as having a gravitational influence on planets. Rather, they use that as sort of a reference point or an analogy in terms of what's going on with the pairs of planets. So our correct answer here will be the first two options. So remember, with these check all that apply, you can have one, two, or all three of them be correct. But in this case, it's the first two that are correct. And now let's look at a third and last example for this video. So this is going to be one of these all of the following except question. And we're going to have to go ahead and read the whole passage first. We'll try to read it quickly here, as quickly as we can. Music critics have consistently defined James P. Johnson as a great early jazz pianist, originator of the 1920s Harlem stride style, and an important blues and jazz composer. In addition, however, Johnson was an innovator in classical music, composing symphonic music that incorporated American and especially African American traditions. Such a blend of musical elements was not entirely new. By 1924, both Milhaud and Gershwin had composed classical works that incorporated elements of jazz. Johnson, a serious musician more experienced than most classical composers with jazz, blues, spirituals, and popular music, was particularly suited to expand Milhaud's and Gershwin's experiments. In 1927, he completed his first large-scale work, the blues and jazz-inspired Yamicraw, which included borrowings from spirituals and Johnson's own popular songs. Yamicraw, premiered successfully in Carnegie Hall, was a major achievement for Johnson, becoming his most frequently performed extended work. It demonstrated vividly the possibility of assimilating contemporary popular music into the symphonic tradition. Okay, so when you have an accept question like this, you're basically looking for 4 answers, and the one that you don't find is going to be the correct answer. So we want to find the ones that are mentioned in the passage. We'll note to begin with that he was a blues and jazz composer. So that means he did compose blues and he did compose jazz. We go a little farther down and find that he composed symphonic music. So now we've got 2 options left. But now we get a little bit of a question here. It says he was more experienced than most classical composers with jazz, blues, spirituals, and popular music. So we might say, does that mean he composed all of them? Well, no. We have to read a little more carefully, and what we find is a reference to his own popular songs. It does not mention anything about his own spirituals. So we can infer that while he was experienced with spirituals, playing ones that other people had written, there's no direct evidence that he actually composed them himself. Kind of tricky, but what we have here is we have evidence that he composed these, and these, but no evidence that he composed these. And that is our correct answer.